The Yamasee War, 1715 to 1717, stands as one of the most perilous crises in early colonial America, a conflict that nearly led to the annihilation of the fledgling English colony of South Carolina. The war's origins lay in years of unchecked exploitation, economic avarice, and the systematic erosion of trust between colonists and Native American tribes. By the time hostilities erupted in May 1715, tensions had reached a volatile breaking point. Charlestown, now modern-day Charleston, became a city under siege, inundated with desperate refugees fleeing a wave of devastation that swept through the countryside. The onslaught was relentless. Yamasee warriors, allied with formidable tribal forces such as the Lower Creek, launched a coordinated campaign of destruction, ravaging South Carolina's plantations, plundering livestock, and slaughtering settlers who failed to find refuge within Charlestown's defenses. Hundreds of native warriors encircled the city, severing its connection to the hinterlands and choking its supplies. Minister Francis Lou Jow captured the dire state of affairs in his haunting account. The Indians that surround us on every side, but the sea revolted from us by unanimous consent. His words underscored the unprecedented scale of the uprising, a far cry from previous isolated skirmishes, now transformed into a unified resistance against colonial expansion. Within Charlestown, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The sudden influx of refugees led to severe overcrowding, fostering disease and exacerbating food shortages. Fear gripped the city as the cries of women and children echoed through the streets. Governor Charles Craven, fully grasping the gravity of their plight, lamented their dire state, describing the colonists as almost naked and defenseless, barely able to mount a viable resistance. In a chilling reflection on their predicament, he wrote, "We know not how soon some of us may be in the hands of those monsters of mankind, the Indians." Meanwhile, Reverend Thomas Hassell interpreted the catastrophe through a theological lens, viewing it as divine retribution for the colony's moral failings. Citing Leviticus, he warned, "When ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy." Yet, this disaster was not inevitable. For much of its early history, South Carolina had maintained a fragile but functional relationship with neighboring Native American tribes, not out of goodwill, but pragmatism. The tribes served as a critical buffer against European adversaries, such as the Spanish and French, as well as hostile indigenous groups further inland. Trade between the colonists and the tribes, at least on the surface, was mutually advantageous. The English provided European goods, firearms, gunpowder, and metal tools, while the tribe supplied deerskins, livestock, and other valuable commodities. Beneath this veneer of cooperation, however, lay a deeply exploitative and volatile dynamic, one fueled by the burgeoning Native American slave trade. South Carolina's early economy, still struggling to establish stable cash crops like rice and indigo, relied heavily on deerskins, livestock, and, disturbingly, enslaved indigenous people. The deerskin trade was so extensive that buckskins became a recognized medium of exchange, giving rise to the term bucks, still used as slang for dollars today. While this linguistic remnant is a mere footnote in history, the far graver consequence of the trade was its role in directly precipitating the Yamasee War. The Lords Proprietors, governing the colony from England, had officially prohibited the enslavement of Native Americans, recognizing its potential to provoke conflict. The enforcement was virtually non-existent. A powerful faction of South Carolina's elite, known as the Goose Creek Men, ruthlessly exploited this loophole. They incentivized the Yamasee and other tribes to conduct slave raids against rival indigenous groups, capturing and selling their people into bondage. In exchange, the Yamasee gained access to valuable European goods, further entrenching their reliance on colonial trade. For a time, this grim arrangement allowed the Yamasee to flourish. By the early 1700s, they had established 10 prosperous towns near Port Royal, South Carolina, with a combined population of roughly 1,300. However, this system began to unravel under the crushing weight of debt. Colonial traders extended credit to the Yamasee and other tribes, permitting them to purchase goods on the promise of future payment. But overhunting led to a sharp decline in the deer population, making it increasingly difficult for the tribes to settle their debts. By 1711, the Yamasee owed over 100,000 deerskins, more than South Carolina's total annual exports. Desperate to recover their losses, traders turned to coercion, threatening to enslave the families of debtors, further inflaming indigenous resentment. The situation reached a boiling point in 1715 when the colony's census revealed a stark demographic imbalance. 28,000 Native Americans spread across 141 towns, compared to only 7,000 European settlers. To many indigenous leaders, this survey appeared less like a routine administrative measure and more like the prelude to large-scale enslavement. Faced with economic oppression, territorial encroachment, and the looming specter of mass subjugation, the Yamasee and their allies resolved to strike first, sparking one of the most harrowing conflicts in colonial American history. Governor Charles Craven sought to defuse tensions by dispatching Indian agent Thomas Nairn and his rival, John Wright, to negotiate with the Yamasee at Pocataligo. However, the two envoys worked at cross purposes, ultimately undermining the very mission they were sent to accomplish. Nairn adopted a conciliatory stance, assuring the Yamasee that their mounting debts would be settled diplomatically and that their lands remained secure. In stark contrast, Wright took an openly antagonistic approach, hurling insults and questioning the Yamasee's loyalty. This contradictory strategy, described by historian William L. Ramsey as a schizophrenic policy, sowed confusion and deepened distrust among the Yamasee leadership. Throughout the night, the Yamasee deliberated. By dawn, their course of action was decided. Adorning their faces with streaks of red and black, symbols of war and death, they launched a ferocious assault. The Pocataligo massacre marked the beginning of the war. Charles Rogge, a colonial merchant, provided a chilling first-hand account. At dawn, their terrible war whoop was heard, resembling devils come out of hell. They fired upon everyone without distinction, inflicting death with the most cruel torments imaginable. Among the first to perish was Thomas Nairn, who suffered a particularly gruesome fate, tortured for days before succumbing to his injuries. This grim episode was recounted in a letter from Rogge to his employer in London, one of the most valuable primary sources documenting the attack and the days that followed. The letter further details the harrowing escape of Captain Burrows, one of the few survivors of the massacre. Struck twice by gunfire, one bullet piercing his neck and exiting through his mouth, the other embedding itself in his back, he somehow remained alive. In a desperate bid for survival, Burrows swam across a river, reaching Port Royal, where he sounded the alarm. Though some colonists initially doubted his warning, the sight of his bloodied wounds, coupled with the distant echoes of gunfire and screams, left little room for skepticism. Panic erupted as settlers scrambled for safety. Roads, now treacherous and controlled by hostile warriors, offered no refuge. Instead, many sought shelter near the water, hoping to escape by sea. Hundreds of terrified colonists crammed aboard a smuggling vessel that had been hastily repurposed for defense. According to Rogge, approximately 400 individuals managed aboard. As darkness fell, the Yamasee, having discovered the deserted homes and plantations, descended upon the shoreline. What followed was a night of relentless terror. War cries and gunfire echoed across the water as the Yamasee unleashed volley after volley at the ship, their voices ringing out in both defiance and triumph. Miraculously, none aboard were harmed. At dawn, the raiders turned their fury toward livestock, systematically slaughtering horses and cattle, looting valuables, and setting every structure ablaze. The settlers, helpless to intervene, watched in horror as their world was reduced to ashes. Rogge later remarked that under different circumstances, the spectacle could have been described as a grotesque victory celebration, if not for the unimaginable devastation it wrought upon the colonists. With the tide rising the next day, The desperate passengers aboard the vessel managed to set sail, heading north toward Charlestown. Others, unable or unwilling to board, braved the open sea in canoes or attempted to navigate the perilous waters of the sea islands. Tragically, the plantations between Pocataligo and Port Royal bore witness to unspeakable bloodshed. Over 100 settlers were either slain or taken captive. Among the more bizarre tales of survival was that of an unnamed man who, realizing his predicament, stripped naked and concealed himself in a marsh. His reasoning was as unconventional as it was effective. By mimicking the appearance of a Yamasee warriors, he hoped to elude detection. Against all odds, his desperate ruse worked, proving that sheer ingenuity could sometimes triumph over imminent death. The fate of Thomas Nairn, however, was far more horrific. Rogg's account describes the excruciating details of his execution. His captors lashed him with heavy wooden beams, set them alight, and left him to endure prolonged agony before finally succumbing to his wounds. This method of execution was not unique. Similar torturous deaths were inflicted upon other captives, sending waves of terror through the colony. Rumors of such ritualistic killings spread rapidly, accelerating the exodus of settlers toward Charlestown. Meanwhile, Governor Craven was already en route to the embattled region with a militia force of 250 men. Unbeknownst to him, Nairn, under extreme duress before his death, had divulged Craven's movements to the Yamasee. Scouts from the tribe quickly located the militia, but bided their time, launching their ambush on April 19th. Despite being outnumbered, the colonial forces held their ground. The disciplined structure of Craven's troops provided a crucial advantage, enabling them to inflict significant losses on their attackers. The engagement left 20 militiamen dead, but resulted in the deaths of several key Yamasee leaders, forcing the warriors to retreat. Among the casualties was a Yamasee warrior carrying a letter intended for Governor Craven. The message, dictated by the Huspa King, a prominent Yamasee leader, and transcribed by a white captive, provided a chilling justification for the war. It accused the colonists of threatening to enslave the Yamasee and execute their leaders, portraying the uprising as an act of desperate resistance. The letter further proclaimed the tribe's intent to seize the colony, boldly predicting the downfall of its forts and settlements. While the decision to reveal strategic information in such a document was arguably a tactical misstep, its core message was unmistakable. We are coming for everything. Yet the Yamasee did not stand alone in their rebellion. Other tribes, including the Lower Creek, Cherokee, and Catawba, each weighed their grievances against the colonists, poised to determine whether South Carolina's tenuous grip on the frontier would finally be broken. The motivations behind the Yamasee War were as complex as they were dire, ranging from crushing debts and the loss of traditional hunting lands to the ever-looming threats of enslavement and mistreatment by colonial traders. In the weeks following the initial uprising, violence spread like wildfire across the backcountry. The toll was staggering. Of the roughly 100 traders operating within native villages, nearly 90 were killed, while the few survivors barely managed to escape with their lives. For many indigenous groups, targeting these traders was more than an act of war. It was a symbolic rejection of colonial exploitation and a demand for a fundamental renegotiation of power. By May, Charlestown swelled with desperate refugees fleeing the carnage. Governor Craven's absence left the city vulnerable, but curiously, the Yamasee war parties never breached its walls. Instead, they focused on a devastating scorched earth campaign, raiding plantations, plundering homesteads, and reducing vast swaths of the countryside to smoldering ruins. Supplies dwindled as crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, and food stores destroyed. Aid from neighboring colonies was scarce and, in some cases, came with egregious conditions. Virginia, for instance, notoriously offered assistance only if South Carolina provided enslaved women in exchange. Amid the chaos, the tide of war began to turn. A pivotal moment came with Captain James Chicken's ambush of a Catawba war party. Though vastly outnumbered, his militia inflicted heavy losses, killing 40 warriors and forcing the Catawba to retreat. This marked the beginning of the war's slow but inevitable decline. In the months that followed, shifting alliances further undermined the indigenous resistance. Some tribes, such as the Cherokee, reconsidered their loyalties and aligned with the English, while others, including the Yamasee, suffered catastrophic losses. By 1717, the war had effectively concluded, leaving South Carolina battered but intact. The Yamasee, scapegoated as the primary instigators of the conflict, were nearly annihilated. Over a quarter of their population was either killed or enslaved. Those who survived faced grim choices. Many fled south, seeking refuge among the Spanish in St. Augustine, while others were absorbed into rival tribes. Meanwhile, South Carolina's reliance on the Native American slave trade diminished, not out of moral reckoning, but out of necessity. However, this shift only redirected the colony's dependence toward the transatlantic African slave trade, setting the stage for the rise of the brutal plantation economy that would define the South for generations. The Yamasee War, one of the deadliest conflicts in colonial American history, laid bare the fragility of frontier life and the volatility of settler-indigenous relations. Yet, despite the bloodshed, the fundamental causes of the conflict remained unresolved. The colonists had survived, but their refusal to address the deeper grievances that fueled the war ensured that cycles of exploitation and violence would persist. History's harshest lessons, it seems, are often recognized too late, if at all.